We have a
Yeah,
guest with us tonight, which is he's appeared. That's a relief. Otherwise, somebody else would have to speak for 20 minutes. Anyway, hats off. Meeting started. Welcome to you all. Welcome to Rotary Club, Bridge of Allan and Dunblane. Now, I have to say, I am buoyant. And as an ex-sailor, that's pretty damn good. Now, Boris flew across the water for a meal. I wonder whether it was a substantial meal. The fact was that he had fish. The fish probably came from UK waters, sourced by the EU. But my interest is in which European budget did it come from? Did it come from the community budget or the charity budget? That's a conundrum I haven't answered yet. But I'm also buoyant because I'm certain that Rotarian Ivor has climbed the cathedral clock tower and fixed the clock. So we now have a cathedral clock that's running on time. And Aidan, what's happened is it's been dormant for a while at 9 o'clock. So the cathedral clock has only been correct twice every day. But I'm buoyant because the clock is now working. So thanks to Rotarian Ivor. So just a quick reminder on etiquette. I'd like you to mute everybody, yourselves. And I'm delighted that Aidan Phillips is here today from the Wave Trust to talk to us about an educational charity dealing with psychological trauma in children. Now, to the best of my knowledge, we don't have any other guests than Aidan. We sometimes do, but nobody's told me about that. So Aidan, if you're ready, by all means, continue your talk. There'll be questions and answers afterwards, if you're happy to take them.
Excellent stuff there. Thank you for that. I'm just going to share the screen now so you can see the presentation. And I'll put that on full screen just so everyone's able to see it. Excellent. Can everyone see that? Thumbs up? Good stuff. So, tonight I'm going to be talking about the topic of trauma-informed schooling. This is an approach that's being increasingly used across Scotland and the rest of the UK, and it's spreading very fast because it's been shown to be a really effective way of actually improving behaviour levels in the school, reducing exclusion rates, and just creating a calm environment so everyone can get on better with their learning. Now, before I talk about that, I'll just introduce myself and the charity a little bit first. So, WAVE was set up in 1996, and it was set up by a couple of people whose job at the time was as business strategic consultants. Now, their job involved them being sent to a different multinational corporation every fortnight, and they would have just 2 weeks to get to the very root of their problem and then show them how to prevent it again in the future. Now, after they adopted the NSPCC as a charity one year, they started looking to see if there are any other charities in the world who were taking the same root causes attitude to the issues of child abuse and child neglect. And they found that whereas there were lots of charities who were supporting children who'd been through this, they really couldn't find any who were looking to prevent it occurring in the first place. And that's why WAVE was born. Now, for the first 10 years or so of our existence, the main focus was on research. It became quite apparent over time that research, that's someone's phone going off there. All right, is everyone just able just to mute the microphone there? Just so thank you. So it became apparent that doing the research and putting it to politicians doesn't mean that it was going to be acted on. And so over time, we've had to evolve. We now work with politicians in the Scottish and UK parliaments. We work with the World Health Organization on a European-wide task force, and we work with activists and local communities right across the UK. Now, in the last 3.5 years that I've been here, this idea of trauma-informed practice has gone from this fringe idea, only used by a few early adopters, to actually catching like wildfire across the country. And it's because of this that this is the reason I focused on most. Now, if I'm going to explain what it means to be trauma-informed to you, it helps if I start off by talking about trauma. And to do this, I'd like you to join me on a walk through the woods. So I'd like you to imagine you're out hiking one day, and as you walk along, you look to your left, and you see this in the clearing, a giant bear. Now, what is going through you at this moment? Well, you're going to have a sharp intake of breath, you'll freeze, you'll feel yourself tense. This is your fight, flight, freeze mode kicking in, your survival mode. And we all know what happens on the outside, but what I want to do is have a look at what's actually happening on the inside of you. So the first thing that happens, you have a small part of your brain called the amygdala, and that sounds the alarm. It says, this is a bear, you know from past experience, the bear's dangerous, so let's get ready for action. And that'll trigger a series of processes throughout your body. One of them will send messages to your adrenal glands next to your kidneys, and it will say produce adrenaline. And that's what opens up your airways and gets your heart pumping faster, getting you ready for action in the moment. Other processes will start to activate some of these longer term stress hormones like cortisol. They'll destabilize your mood, raise your blood pressure, and disrupt your sleep patterns, because you can't be going into a deep sleep if there are going to be bears wandering about. Your immune system will start to fire up, so that if the bear does manage to swipe you, you can start sending inflammation to that point as quickly as possible. And one other very interesting thing that happens here is that the parts of your brain that deal with some of the slower, more rational thinking start to dial down, as this is not the time to be philosophizing about bears, and your emotional instincts will take over. So this is a very good system, and it's very good if it only occasionally has to be activated to deal with the occasional threat. But what happens if you feel like you're in a constant state of threat? What happens if this system is constantly being activated all the time? What happens if, as a child, you go home every day and the bear is still there? Here are some of the adversities that children can experience. The potential to go from merely being a stressful incident which happened in the past to being a traumatic incident that has long-lasting negative consequences. All trauma really is a frozen memory. It's a memory of a stressful incident or environment, which instead of just being processed, never really fully got consigned to the past. And the reason is because the brain never fully felt like it had gotten back to a place of safety. It felt like it had to remain activated, either because it was so overwhelming in the moment, or because the stressful incident occurred consistently over a long period of time. Now, you can see how certain instances here could definitely lead to that. Living in a war zone, living in a violent household, they don't really require too much explanation. Something like parental separation is a good example of a very key aspect here. It's not necessarily the existence of the incident. Some people experience the same thing but have different reactions. It's not even necessarily the severity of it, as much as that has an impact. It's the context within which it happens and the stage of development you're at that depends whether or not it goes on to cause trauma. So let's say, for instance, you're 22 years old and your parents separate. It's going to be a sad thing to happen, and you're certainly not going to be happy about it. But you know, you're an independent adult, you're fully aware that you're able to look after yourself. This isn't actually a threat to you. But what if you're 2 years old? And especially if there's an acrimonious, angry breakup. Your rational brain hasn't even fully developed. You don't really understand the world. All you know is you're entirely dependent on these two people. You're fiercely attached to them, and they're warring. Things feel chaotic and unstable. And so the very basis of how you understand the world seems to be cracking. That can be both overwhelming and consistent enough to have the same impact as the previous two examples. And so it's the perception of the incident at the time at which it occurs that really makes the difference here, and the context around it. Now, if you to look at a definition of psychological trauma, you'll see it says that it can occur as a result of a single event, if it really is that overwhelming, or a set of circumstances and an environment you're in. And this is often key because these sorts of adversities tend to come along like buses, 2 or 3 at once. If you have a father who's very violent towards your mother, it's not exactly unheard of that you might have a problem with alcohol, or that she may have mental health issues as a result of this, or that he might be violent towards you too. It's also quite key to take into account that as much as there is the physical aspect of this threat, which doesn't require too much explanation, it's the emotional harm that's done that's also important too. So if you're, say, for instance, beaten unpredictably by a parent while they're taking alcohol, then it's not just the physical threat of what's happening that's causing the damage. It's the fact that you trust this person to protect you and suddenly it's being turned on you. You love this person, they say they love you, and it's contradicting what's happening right now. And so not only would you go on to say, for instance, have an aggressive streak or be quite anxious, but you might also not know who you can trust or whether or not you can really build a proper relationship with someone. A lot of these things happening subconsciously rather than consciously thinking them through. Now, in terms of how it impacts you, you can have an impact on people's day-to-day behavior, feeling a bit more tense, more tendency to draw out, tendency to have little habits, tendency to get anxious. You can have an impact on your physical health for the constant pouring of stress into your body. And the knock-on effects of all this and the way you perceive yourself and the way you perceive others can increase the likelihood of this vast range of negative outcomes. You can become more likely to be depressed or to become an alcoholic. You can become more likely to be violent to your partner or a victim of said violence, remarkably similar probabilities there. You can even be more likely to contract something as seemingly distant as heart disease or liver disease decades later, as the accumulated impact of all of these things, plus their knock-on effects, takes its toll. The message here really is that trauma is by no means a small area of public health. It's a major impact and has a major effect on many, many individual lives and countless social issues through it. And that's why I'm really glad to say that nowadays, we're seeing an increasing amount of interest being put towards it. Not just seeing it as the issue it is, but also focusing on the solutions that are there to prevent it and mitigate its impact. And I'm glad to say this is the point where I get to say that's the depressing, miserable part of the talk over, because now we get to talk about the solutions and the more optimistic side. So, trauma-informed schooling, one of the solutions we promote the most. And the first thing to say about it is that, yes, it's nice. It's compassionate. And by all means, I believe that the vast majority of school staff doing this are doing this for these reasons. They care about their students. They want what's best for them. However, it's also worth emphasising that the reason it's being taken up across the UK is because it's effective. Here's a handful of results from some UK and US schools and districts that I've looked into, where in each case they managed to get much better results within a relatively short time span. And having looked through dozens of different case studies and constantly finding out about more, I can say that these are by no means exceptional. When you actually start working on the roots of the issue and working on a psychological basis, you really can turn things around. Now, to have a trauma-informed school doesn't mean that you take a different approach with some students some of the time. It's not an intervention, it's not a program. It's about the wider culture. It's about the way in which staff approach each interaction, the lens through which they see all their policies and practices. And because it's this all-encompassing, then the principles underpin it are quite key. And what you'll notice looking at this wheel here is what you're effectively trying to provide are the very things that a child will not have experienced during the moment of adversity itself. They're very unlikely to have experienced a sense of safety, having felt that vulnerable, both in terms of physical safety, but also the ability to be taken seriously and actually talk about these things. Compassion and respect are often things that are absent in these moments. And you can see how trust might be fractured, given that many of these incidents, whether malicious or as many of these are unintentional, often occur within the context of close family relationships. Control is a very key thing too. To have actually been in a moment where you felt that vulnerable, by default, you can't have felt like you were in control. And because of that, people who experience trauma often go on to become quite obsessive about controlling things in their life, and sometimes about controlling others too. So having that sense of control in your life is key. Now you'll see in the middle here, I put healing happens in relationships. And that's because this is the glue that holds all of this together. We're social animals. And as with all other aspects of life, people are often most easily able to achieve all of these impressions, and in some cases only ever realistically able to achieve them within the context of an actual authentic relationship, genuine connection with someone. And I emphasize this because as much as it's by no means uncommon for teachers to bond with their students, it may not historically have always been seen as the professional thing to do or an important part of the profession. Whereas the trauma-informed approach actually emphasizes that because of our psychological needs, this is actually key to getting the best results out of people. About 20 years ago, one of the pioneers in this field was in Philadelphia, and he was standing on stage, and a member of the audience said, "Can you try and sum up this approach in the space of a sentence?" And he said, "It's a bit like you stop saying, 'What's wrong with you?' and you start asking, 'What happened to you?'" And I think it's a very good way of summing it up, because it does get to the heart of what you're trying to achieve here. Rather than merely looking at the behaviors on the surface, rather than assuming they're coming from a malicious place, that they're trying to do it against you, rather than even assuming they're always rational, a lot of them have an emotional basis. You're always asking, if it's challenging, if it's persistent, what came first to lead them to this point? What is the story behind this? What are the emotions behind this? And how can I focus on them? And it's not really just a compassionate way of thinking, it's a more productive line of questioning too, if you're actually looking for solutions. And it's because the schools I showed you before started asking these much more productive questions that they started getting those better results. Now, late last year, I started this research project where I set about to create a briefing on what it means to be a trauma-informed school in the UK. And the way in which I chose to do this was by approaching lots of schools in the country who had not only done this, but actually achieved good results through it. And then I basically asked them how they did it. And these key messages, the 6 consistent things that came out of these conversations with about 32 different practitioners across the country. And I'm going to run through them quickly now, and then what I'll do is I'll give you a few case studies so I can flesh out what they look like in practice. The first one really relates to that sentence I just gave you. The idea that as often as possible, you want to actually be responding to the root of the behavior, not just what's happening on the surface. This can be as simple as teachers just routinely following these scripts to make sure they're always trying to find out the emotions behind the behavior. It often involves working closely with partners in social services and the police so they can learn what's actually happening in the child's life. Some schools even went as far as to do basic psychometric testing with the students. And one showed me how this could all work together when they showed me this anonymized graph. And they showed how the test showed that the child's aggressiveness had spiked, at the same time as the number of times they've been sent to our office had spiked, at the same time as they knew from their work with health services that their mum had been taken into hospital. Once you actually know what's at the root of the behavior, you have a much better chance of actually turning it around. The second part is the idea that all staff members should really see building relationships with students as a key part of their role, partly to achieve all of the things we'll be talking about today, but also one of the key reasons to have everyone see this as a key part is because if you're looking for a genuine, authentic connection, that depends on someone naturally clicking. And there's no guarantee every kid's going to naturally click with your pastoral team or your key adults or whoever you've designated to take a role. They could click with the receptionist, the PE teacher, the math teacher, anyone. And so you want everyone to be willing to step into this position and play that role if needs be. Now, for the third point, I talk about creating a therapeutic environment. And when I say this, I'm not necessarily talking about counselling, as beneficial as that obviously can be. What I'm talking about is you take the concepts that work within therapy and you try and bring them into the school environment. So whenever you're in a room having therapy, the entire room is designed to calm you down, from the choice of paintings to furniture to lighting. No matter what you're being told, no matter how blunt, no matter how uncomfortable it may be, you're always being talked to in a calm, respectful way. And you always feel like you can open up if needs be. Now, trauma-informed staff will bring this into every interaction they do. They'll look at the activities, the extracurricular activities they have with students. They'll see that they can build self-regulation, grounding, teaching them these skills to actually look after their own mental health into it. They'll set aside different spaces in the school where you can actually go and get out of your head and get back into a more productive working state. And I'll give an example on why then very soon. Now at this point, you sometimes get people asking, okay, so it sounds like it's very good at being supportive, very good at caring for the children. What about maintaining order within the school? How do you actually enforce discipline? One of the key things to actually emphasize here is that as much as you're taking a compassionate approach, that actually having a predictable rules system is compassion in itself. A lot of the kids who are breaking the rules often either had no rules at home, so they've never had the benefit of that stability and being able to build self-discipline, or they had a rigid, vicious rules system in which they actually need to be shown how discipline can be beneficial for them. So actually making sure the rules are always adhered to so it's predictable and it's stable is really important and emphasized. But what they'll often do is they'll look at the way in which the rules are carried out and say, what are they actually learning from this that's going to make them less likely to do the behaviour in future? So for instance, when I spoke to some schools in Gloucestershire, they might have a couple of kids in the secondary who have a fight in the playground. They usually get sent to the principal's office, given a shouting at, suspended. They said, we don't really think they're really learning anything from this. So what they do instead, they bring them into a classroom. They both have to say what happened from their perspective. And then they say, we're not leaving until you two have actually told us what the next steps are. And if it's too light, sorry, if it's too light, the teacher says, try again. If it's too harsh, she says, tone it down. Ultimately, the consequence is always as severe as it would have been anyway. But in order to get there, they have to be more likely to empathise with the other person, and they have to actually come to an agreement like they're going to have to do as mature adults in the future. So that making sure they're actually building skills rather than just being punished for the sake of it. They also given a sense of responsibility, and that really ties into the fifth one here. I said earlier that people who've been through trauma often desire a sense of control in their life. Well, how do you give students a sense of control without disrupting their actual hierarchy? One of the key ways is just to give them more responsibilities. I know one school that killed two birds with one stone here. They got the kids to design their own breathing exercises and then to deliver them around the school. Apparently they had one particularly enthusiastic 7-year-old who was doing this to many of the classes. Other ways are just simply looking at ways to actually compromise with the kids' needs and the needs to actually keep things running smoothly. In one school, they'd have some kids who had PTSD or ADHD or something else that really made it genuinely difficult to concentrate. And usually they'd end up acting up in class. And instead they said to them, look, if you get in a state where you really know you can't focus, you're allowed to stand up, you don't have to ask the teacher, and just walk outside for 10 minutes and then come back. And you know, these things are sometimes involve some trial and error, sometimes they're about to speak to the kids who are taking the mick with it. But they found the vast majority actually comply with it, especially when they get the impression the school is actually paying attention to them. Now this final point here, number 6, essentially what this means is that you take all of those concepts and you do it with the staff too. Because if you're asking staff members to remain calm and respectful, if you're asking them to invest in building relationships, which is a hell of a lot harder than just kicking the kid out of school, very hard thing to do if they're stressed and if they're at the end of their tolerance. It's also very difficult to do if they're being told this by leadership, whereas they think the leadership are actually not treating them the same way. So as much as in theory all this could work without it, in practice, none of this really works unless there's a real supportive team culture among the staff. Now, I saw this when I went to a school in Greenwich, a pupil referral unit where every kid had a traumatic past, most kids had a traumatic present. It was a stressful work environment. And at the end of every day, the head teacher would get the staff into the room and they could get things off their chest. For starters, people could give them ideas, people could give them support. The assistant teacher in the classroom could tell the head if something wasn't working. They actually had that level of openness. Everyone actually ended every day feeling like everyone had their back before they restarted the next one. So I gave a few examples of how that worked in practice there. I'm going to give a few more here before I wrap up, because it does help flesh out what this actually looks like. First, I'm going to go to disciplinary procedures again. I'm going to go to this primary school in Newport. Now, they were looking at the way in which they were doing timeouts for the kids. And usually the kid would act up, would be sent to the corridor, have to stand there for a while everyone's looking at them. Teacher comes out, tells them off, sends them back in. Now, they realised there was a slight contradiction here in that, on the one hand, they're actually trying to build relationships with these kids. And every now and again, they were actually humiliating them by making them stand outside and giving them a telling off in front of everyone. Or at least that was the response from the kids, the thing that had the greatest impact on them. So they said, how can we make sure there's still the same degree of consequence without actually fracturing the relationship? What they'll do now is they send the kid outside, but instead they send them to another class. And as they get to know the kid, they'll send them to the person who they know they get on well with. As they go in, kids are coming in and out, the class doesn't really notice, the teacher just says, go sit in the corner, I'll speak to you when I'm free. Always gives it 10, 15 minutes, so they've had a chance to calm down. Then they'll go speak to them. The first thing they say is, okay, you tell me what happened first. And they help them get off their chest. And then they tell them what the consequence is going to be. And it's a very clever approach because it's ticking off all these things which actually help us calm down as people before they tell them what the consequence is. 1, you're not speaking to the person you've had a flare-up with or after you felt humiliated. 2, you're speaking to the person you like and respect. Genuinely harder to be angry with that person. 3, you're only hearing the consequence after you've calmed down and after you've had a chance to get your say off your chest. They found the cooperation from the kids was so much better because by the time they've heard the consequence, they're in just a much calmer state to actually want to comply with it. So they move on to another school, this one in North Manchester here. Now this is a place where they've got high rates of domestic violence, high rates of poverty. They're top of all the league tables you don't want to be top of. And a lot of kids, they've seen violence the night before, they live in chaotic households. They need to get out of their heads every now and again. They can't really focus on learning. And so what the school sought to do was they sought to create spaces so they could actually go to and actually self-regulate for a little bit before they went back to the classroom. One of these was just as simple as putting a cushion outside the classroom. And they said, you can't focus, just take yourself outside, work there for 10 minutes. And I walked around the school, I saw this happen like clockwork. Another one was a dark room where the only light they had was a lava lamp in the corner. And this is for the kids who really do actually need a few hours out. And they'll take their work there, they'll do it instead, and the pastoral team will site themselves there so they can actually talk to someone if needs be. Now, another room was a small cupboard-sized room with a thick door. Now, as I said, a lot of these kids see screaming and shouting, and a lot of them don't actually know how to deal with things any other way. And teachers said, right, instead of them blowing up in class, we're going to say to them, if you feel like you're on the verge of blowing up here, then just take yourself to this room. And the kids do it. They walk across the school, they go into this room, scream, shout, hit the wall, you can't hear it behind the door, walk out again, go to the dark room, talk about it. In just 12 months during their pilot year, this school managed to reduce its exclusion rate by 88%. Really quite impressive. Now I'm going to end here with a secondary school example because I've given a couple of primaries. And I really like this one because as much as showing support and nurturing and actually helping children cope with adversity in the moment is key, and in many ways is character building. You give a child a sense of self-worth. Well, you treat a child as if they're worthwhile, they'll get a feeling of self-worth. This also shows that this approach also builds in some of the more traditional aspects of character building too. So I asked a deputy head at the school, I said, what do you do with the kids who are victims of bullying? And he says, well, take them into the staff room, give them a chance to calm down, ask how they are, what's happened, how's it got to this point, anything else in their life, make them feel cared for, make them feel supported, and put them in taekwondo classes. And I said, what? Changed a little bit at the end there. He said, well, look, it's very important to make sure this kid feels loved and supported. But right now, he sees himself as a victim. And quite frankly, he looks like a victim. And he sounds like a victim. And if nothing else really changed in his life, I bet he's going to grow up to be a victim. We don't just need to support them with the adversity right now in their life. We need to actually build them up as people, build their self-confidence, build their character so they can cope with adversity in later life too. And that's a key part of this, teaching them self-regulation, actually building those relationships with them, showing them and role modeling how to deal with situations calmly, all helps build them up as people, as well as supporting them in the moment too. And that's a key part of the approach. So, in today's presentation, good news, there's a hell of a lot of good stuff happening across the UK at the moment, including in Scotland. In Wales, I'll go to first here. They've got this hub which is offering this training to every school in the country. They've got an incredibly ambitious program going on. Glasgow started taking a similar approach just over 10 years ago, where they introduced these units into the school to take this particularly nurturing approach to the most challenging students. Their exclusion rates has gone down 90% from what it used to be. And Scotland, having been inspired by this, is now more than 50% lower what it used to be. It's an amazing turnaround happening. After the success of the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit, we're now seeing these violence reduction units set up in 18 areas across the UK. And just like their predecessor, they're looking at the connections between trauma, school exclusion, and later life crime. And they're saying, if we take this approach with the kids in the school, we're going to help them identify some of the underlying emotions, actually help them deal with it, and actually help divert them onto a path they may later have gone on. So there's a lot of good stuff that's happening at the moment. However, there's still some way to go. Prior to this, the previous craze in terms of dealing with behaviour management was zero tolerance schooling. And granted, like all approaches, it'll have its merits, but we feel like it doesn't really get to the heart of the problem as well. It doesn't create as many long-term benefits. And so there's still some people there to be convinced. You'd have some local authorities who haven't encountered this or haven't really started exploring it. Ofsted and the other regulators, they are moving this direction, but it's still taking time. There's still some way to go. As much as I'm glad to say there's more activity happening in the devolved parliaments, at a UK national policy level, they're talking a lot, but they're not really doing anything with this, as well as in many cases in the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish parliaments too. So I think there's still some way to go for the politicians to actually live up to their words. What are we looking to do? Well, we're looking to keep this momentum going. We work with individual schools and trusts, with local authorities, with all UK parliaments. We simply just try to keep pushing for more and more change in this area. We spoke with the Department of Education at a UK level earlier today. We spoke with the Department of Education in Northern Ireland recently, and we're always in touch with individual schools. We're looking to get to the point we don't just have a 90% exclusions drop in Glasgow, but across the whole of the UK. And where you got every kid who has a teacher who understands their mind as well as they understand their subject. Now, if you'd like to support us in this goal, whether that's financially or whether or not you want to work together to introduce this to more schools in your area, I'll be very happy to work with you. But otherwise, I hope you found that interesting. And if you do have any questions, please do fire away.
Well, thank you very much, Aidan. All of you, please remain unmuted and raise your hand if you want to ask a question. And between Rod and I, we will allow that individual to pose the question. So anybody wants to speak first, raise the hand. Graham Russell.
Thanks, Aidan. That was really interesting talk. Do you get invited into schools, or do you invite yourself in, and do you ever get resistance to trying to get involved from the schools?
And we have a whole range of approaches. So for instance, we'll contact loads of schools and introduce it to them and see who gets back. Recently we trained loads of schools in Croydon where the tender had been put out by the local authority and they'd identified the schools that are interested. And sometimes we have schools coming to us as we did from that. So it really is a range of things. In terms of resistance, what I've consistently heard from staff whenever I spoke to them is they say it's never the new staff coming in. They're not the resistant ones, it's the old guard. They've been working for 15, 20, 25 years. They've got their approach. They're quite resistant to change. By no means in every single instance, but that is often what happens. So, but sometimes you find that even when a person's quite resistant, sometimes they do it to an extent. I had an interesting moment when I went into a school in Croydon. I said, are all your staff doing this? He went, oh yeah, all the staff are doing this. And I went, well, wait a minute. When I walked in, the student walked in late and someone gave him a bollocking. That doesn't sound like doing it. They went, him. Interesting one, that. He said, he screams and shouts at the students more than anyone else, but he also always has a restorative conversation and builds relationships with them better than anyone else. So actually they like him more than any other staff member here. And so what you find is sometimes even the resistant ones are actually doing a lot of it to a large extent already.
Thank you.
Thank you, Graham Russell. Next question, please.
Craig's got one.
I can't hear the question there. Is someone on mute?
Hello, sir.
Craig, you're muted.
Craig, if you have a question, please unmute yourself and go for it.
Okay, sorry, I didn't hear you mention my name. Aidan, that was really interesting. And as a teacher, I could tune into a lot of what you were talking about. What surprises me, though, is that you are, I guess, if you're a trust, then that makes you a charity of some kind. So surely your ambition must be that you convert so many people to the cause, persuade so many authorities and so on to understand what you're doing, that you can actually eventually dissolve yourselves. Would that be the goal?
Oh God, I wish. Well, this is just one area of what we're looking in. We're also focused on prevention of trauma in the early years. We're focused on spreading this information to the wider community so parents can take it on board and we can get right to the root in the household. And once we stop working with the UK, we're now working with the World Health Organization across Europe. So it'd be wonderful if we ever got to a point one day when we could dissolve, but I get the feeling in the decades left in my career, I may never get to that point. But certainly we're making fast progress. I mean, look, a few years ago, this was a fringe term that barely anyone had heard of. Now I hear people complaining that it's a buzzword. which I think is a wonderful complaint to hear given given what's happened in that time period. And it's being adopted by so many places now and they're all getting the same sort of results consistently again. So it's really encouraging to see. So maybe this area alone, hopefully we get to the point in my career where we become redundant and we get to move on completely to something else.
Thank you very much, Craig. Peter Williams.
Yeah, thank you very much, Aidan. That's a really interesting talk. I just want, you're obviously doing this sort of effectively starting at piecemeal, but shouldn't it be your ambition to go and make sure these kind of things are taught at teacher training colleges and get it, institutionalized and get it mainstream? And do you need political support to do that?
Absolutely. I think they're actually started doing that in Wales. Wales seems to be further ahead than anyone at the moment in this sense, and they're actually integrating into the uni colleges, into the uni courses, I mean. But no, a lot of our work is political. So we run something called the 70-30 campaign, which is focused on preventing trauma, but also brings in approaches such as this. And we seek endorsements from politicians in all parliaments. I think we've got something like 80% of the Scottish Parliament, 2/3 of the UK Parliament. And that's what we do. We have these conversations with them to try and win them over to pushing for policy. And also we try and use that as a stepping stone to get to the civil service. So recently we worked for a politician to get a meeting with the Department of Education, then had a meeting with them today. And then we're going to try and go from then on to Ofsted to have a meeting with them. So we're one of many people always trying to push for this on a policy level. And also local authorities too. I mean, in Scotland, you're fortunate that you've actually got this nationwide approach being taken. But in England in particular, it's usually led by local authorities. So it's about convincing the CEOs and the council leaders there too. But certainly we're always trying to take the strategic approach. But in some cases, what you need for the strategic approach is you need individual organisations to be the pioneers to prove that it works first.
Thank
you.
Thanks for the question, Peter.
Jill's got a hand up.
Oh, yeah. I missed the beginning of your talk, by the way, but I think it's absolutely fantastic that you're actually linking the potential of trauma as being a factor for some behaviors. I think it's amazing because I think that is the cause of some behaviors. But I like the whole process that you're introducing, because what you're doing is it's very consensual. It's not a disciplinary, so to speak, but more of a consensual process. And I think that is hugely important. And it also, you're acknowledging the facts and circumstances, not denying it. And I love the idea that you said the question's not what's wrong with you, but what happened. I love that. I mean, that just really hits the nail on the head. One of the things I was interested in, though, was whether if you factor in and how you do it, a sense of forgiveness into the students in situations like that, because some of the issues that arrive, it's about letting go, isn't it? And so how do you factor that into it? That sort of almost like alternative dispute resolution, alternative way of perceiving the issue. How do you do that?
I think in these cases, it's about trying to actually get in a position where you tick off all the markers that people need. And a lot of these sort of disciplinary situations, especially when someone's stressed, their emotions that need to be soothed rather than anything tangible that needs to happen. They need to feel like they got something, feel like they've gained something from it, feel like they've had control over the process, feel like they've had a say. Once a person feels all these things have happened, they tend to find themselves calming down afterwards. It's rarely the actual outcome itself that they might care about. But I understand in there, and
I think it's amazing anyway. So well done that you're doing this. It's great. Really good.
Thank you, Jill. Ken Murray, you got your hand up?
Yes, thank you, Aidan. That was absolutely fascinating. Are you doing anything with parents as well as with the schools? Because some of it must be parental activity that needs to be addressed rather than just the children.
Yeah, you will notice a lot of schools that after spending a couple of years usually get into grips with changing their own culture, they'll start reaching out to the parents too. And I had a wonderful conversation with someone who'd done this in San Diego for quite a few years the other day, where he talked about the fact that they got parents in and they trained up the parents to then deliver the training to the other parents, as there was a sort of peer-to-peer relationship and they felt like they had a better understanding. And then from then they diffused it out to the wider community. And in part, that's just to let the parents know what the school's doing. They have a right to understand what approach is being taken.
Absolutely.
But also it's about they to actually get that understanding out there. So what they're doing in the school is them being compounded in a positive way with what's happening at home. It also links into what we're trying to do as a charity. So I'd say of all the sectors out there, school's probably the second most important because of the amount of time they spend with the students, those opportunities to build those relationships. First one is the early years, because you're in direct contact with the parents at the very moment at which they're developing and is most vulnerable to both trauma and positive influences too. And so that's another area we work in. We really do try to get very close to the parents.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. Next question. Arthur, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did say early on. Thank you very much indeed for a fascinating talk. It was really interesting. I don't have an awful lot to do with education at that age, much later on. But I was going to ask a question, really in the current situation, looking at the student population, the early student population go back to university this year in the situation that they're going to, and hitting brick walls and hitting unfortunate situations. One of the things in my mind on this is that it is kind of showing them not to have a huge amount of resilience. And so is this development of dealing with the trauma, is it helping to make the children more resilient as they go through life and able to cope with things better than not cope with them? Because I certainly, looking at it just now, I can see a great lack of resilience in that age group that seems to be coming through just now. I don't know what you think about it, whether I'm a boring old guy who interprets things the wrong way or not.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things over the change we've had over the last 50, 100 years is that I don't think a lot of instances of trauma have been avoided. You know, maybe there's probably less beating of children and then probably more parental separation. It probably evens out over time. But a lot of the things that help people build resilience throughout their childhood are gone. So you don't have a strong community within the neighborhood, which effectively acted as your extended family. You tend to live in smaller families, in more often single parent families too. Spending less time outside, actually spending time with other people, more time inside online. There's lots of these various things which actually help to build people's resilience over time and their emotional capacity, which just seem to be lacking or have dumbed down. And I think that's probably had a big impact on the mental health of people in my generation, generations too. And one of the good things about this approach is that, yes, you're supporting people who've been through adversity, both trauma and other kinds, also trying to build them up. You bring in activities which on the face of it look different, something like drumming, but actually the focus is on helping them get the hang of self-regulating and doing the beat. When you actually go into some of the rooms set aside and get the pastoral support, the focus is on teaching them grounding exercises, meditative exercises, actually teaching them how their brain works so they know how to interpret it properly. And actually a lot of the things you're doing here in terms of taking the calm, respectful approach is you're constantly trying to role model something and show them how to react in a better way, both towards themselves and others. So there's a key aspect here where you're actually teaching them how to look after themselves. And one of the interesting things, by the way, and this is a real new thing, in Wales, they're bringing in a new school curriculum. And when you look at the main subjects, you know, literacy, humanities, sciences, it's not really that different. One key difference is that personal and mental health or something like that is one of the key subjects. And they've brought neuroscientists in to help develop this curriculum to teach the kids to understand their own minds throughout their entire school career. And I think if that's the direction we go in, then we're going to have what is effectively this massive social experiment of kids who are taught to actually look after their mental health in a degree that no generation has ever had before. And if we can move in that direction with this approach, I think that'd be incredible. I don't think we'll be seeing some of the mental health crises we see today.
Thank you very much, Alistair. There's time for one more question. Any takers? Okay, thank you very much indeed for your questions. I'm now going to ask Rotary Nick to give a vote of thanks. And Nick actually works with young people, so I'm sure he's got a keen interest in the talk.
Hi Aidan, thank you. I'm pleased to do the vote of thanks tonight. One of my interests is on the Scottish Hearing System panel. So I see traumatised kids every month, and it often starts in the home, but the school is the important place where they can be helped if the home can't be sorted out. And also my daughter's a child psychiatrist, and if you want to see my daughter as a consultant psychiatrist in the Forth Valley, it would take 9 months unless it's an emergency. And an emergency is life-threatening. So the Scottish Government say the right things, but they only spend 7 pence in every £100 on child mental health. So it's vital that the schools do their bit to stop it getting to the psychiatrists. And so your work is essential. So really pleased about that. Children are our future. If we don't help them, our civilization's at risk. So thank you very much. I noticed you went to Sheffield University. I went to Leeds, so that's a rival, but somebody's got to go there. And and you met Joe Cocker, I think. Is he the most famous Sheffield man ever?
He may be. But I do like to say at least I went to the good Sheffield Uni, just in case there's anyone from Sheffield.
Aidan, you've seen by the questions tonight that you've captured the attention of this audience, and we wish you the very best in the future, the lobbying, the help in the schools, and everything that you're doing, and all the very best for the future. And thank you for joining us tonight. The usual way used to be a clap of hands. I think we can do a silent clap of hands for Aidan. So could you join me in saying thanks to Aidan for tonight's talk? Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for inviting me along there. I like the person who both clapped and then put the clap icon onto the screen at the same time there.
Double clap.
Excellent stuff.
Thank you, Aidan. Thank you, Rotary and Nick. We're learning about Zoom as we go along, Aidan. We're getting better at it, better than some other people. So, reminders, just a bit of housekeeping for us all. I've invited you all to a chat on Monday. It's not a visitor chat per se, it's a social chat on Monday, just to talk amongst ourselves. There's no agenda. There could be breakout rooms if there's getting enough people. We just have a chat about life and find out how we're all doing. Thursday, the 17th of December is a business meeting and a special general meeting. And there's no meeting on Christmas Eve, the 24th of December. I think I'll be stuffing a chicken. I'm not quite sure what everyone else is doing, but it's a bit early, but I hope you're all looking forward to Christmas and you've got plans in place. It's a tricky time for everybody. So just a couple of comments as we close out tonight. Couple of comments for your own benefit, Aidan. We fly around in normal circumstances, and the pilots of planes write a maintenance report, which goes down to the maintenance crews. And I've got a couple of comments here from a pilot who said, friction locks cause throttle levers to stick. And the answer from the maintenance guy was, that's what friction locks are for. Then there was another one here, target radar hum, reprogrammed target radar with lyrics. And the last one, mouse in cockpit. And the mechanic said, cat installed in cockpit. And finally, purportedly from Stirling Council complaints letters, there's one that said, the toilet is blocked and we cannot bath the children until it's cleared. Our toilet seat is broken in half and is now in 3 pieces. And finally, our kitchen floor is damp. We have 2 children and would like a third. So please send someone around to do something about it. And with that, I thank you all for joining in. It's good to see so many of you here, some stimulating questions. It's very, very interesting, the work that you do. So thank you very much for coming along. And I wish you all well, and I look forward to those who want to join me on the social chat on Monday. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, everyone. Have a good night then.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.